All right, we'll get underway. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues, our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, or as we say, people who are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Peter Park. Some of you may remember Peter from his days here in Milwaukee. He was the former city planner here, also the former city planner and county planner for Denver. He has taught at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He is currently teaching at the University of Colorado in Denver, and he has his own private business, which works on city planning and design issues. He's also participating in another event on campus today, so we're especially happy that he could find a few minutes to join us today. Won't you please welcome Peter Park back to Milwaukee. Peter, good to have you. Actually, just flew in from you were in Portugal?
I was in Lisbon.
You were in Lisbon, so we're really happy.
I got here last night.
I know. We're very happy to have you back here. And
I've chosen off. Just catch me.
I have that effect on people sometimes. So the temptation for me is to get right to Milwaukee stuff and ask Peter about things that were done during his tenure and things that could be done in the future. But I'm going to hold off on that a little bit to have a somewhat larger conversation about the future of cities. And I wanted to begin with this. I mean, we certainly know that people are moving to cities all around the world, but in America, I want to get your perspective on this. Are we seeing an urban renaissance, or is that a bit overstated?
No, it's true. It's happening in significant ways in sort of the Sunbelt cities. It's not happening in all cities, but for the most part, as a trend, yeah. I mean, I've been working in Austin, Texas. I helped Houston, the city of Houston, get started on its first general plan ever. Mm-hmm. Houston, a city, for those of you who are attorneys, famous for not having a zoning code, as you know.
Yes, there's a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah, but they have a lot of regulations. I mean, it's Texas, they like to say they don't have zoning, okay, but they've got plenty of regulations, right? Maybe not as many as many cities. They're growing considerably. I'm working in Los Angeles. Their work is planning around growth. So in Denver, that's so much of what the work was about.
Give me a sense of, you've named a few cities here, but other places where you see cities working well, you see in terms of design issues, in terms of transit issues, in terms of zoning. Portland, Denver, where are the places that really have it right?
Well, I think, so there are many cities that have it right. And I think the cities that have the greatest opportunities are cities, quite frankly, like Milwaukee. Cities that have good bones, they have real gravitas to the character of its history and how the history of the people that came before created a great environment. Quite frankly, I think those are the best places. Even cities that are in decline, let's say, or not growing as quickly as others, it's those particular places that are the strength of what's growing a city like Detroit back. I mean, there's unbelievable quality still left in every American city. And those are the places that you can't replicate. You can't, those are the real jewels of the cities in our country. And I think, and small towns, the same thing in small and medium-sized towns. The original Main Street, this is the place that I think people are really responding to and want to be part of.
I mentioned design as being an important part of a city's livability. Is that overlooked by too many cities? Are cities too quick to cede their rights to good design, to good long-term design?
I think the question of design is so one of the challenges about design of cities, I think, is we often think of it as the realm of architects. right? As it ought to be. Much of what we, I think, sometimes are challenged by is the notion that architecture is about the design of things, the design of objects, sort of a sculpture, if you will. And really, architecture, to be complete, I think, needs to be about the relationship of form and what people really need, and the relationship of buildings to each other in terms of shaping the public realm and the public spaces that everybody experiences, right? So, design is important. It's essential to making a great city. I think it's largely a question of, well, where's the focus, or how wide is the mandate of what the design is supposed to deal with? When you see a drawing or renderings of buildings, of a shiny new building or some great proposal, or the publication of a great piece of architecture, if you don't see people in the picture, there's a problem, I think. I don't know. I sort of look at that as, that's a nice sculpture, but I wonder if it's failed the context of where it's supposed to be.
You said design should be timeless. That one of the things that I think you said that bothers you is if you see somebody trying to perhaps replicate something from the past. Elaborate a bit on that.
Well, yeah, I do believe that design should be of its time, and there are principles of design that are actually quite timeless. How buildings relate to the climate and the context, the built context as well as the environmental context. Understanding the history of the place. I think, we went through this phase after World War II of demolishing our cities, in great, enormous effort of destruction of unbelievable buildings and architecture and neighborhoods and displacement of people for new priorities. And then that gave rise to the historic preservation movement. And quite frankly, if it wasn't for the legal profession, not the architectural profession, the legal profession, I don't think we would have historic preservation, right? Because only attorneys could figure that out. But think about it, like we had to actually come up with a way to stop ourselves from destroying the places where we lived. Wow. What a sophisticated society we've become, right? And so then there were a number of, theories and movements in architecture and so forth. But the replication of these historical forms, it's hard to do it right. You can always tell it's just not right. That's not what it's about, I don't think. I think what architecture and good architecture does is it embraces, well, what are these things that we have available to us in terms of technology, in terms of new materials, in terms of performance, and how can we use these forms in ways and these materials in ways that make buildings that first and foremost are for people and the accommodation and the support of people living. Vitruvius had basically three principles of design, of great architectures: firmness, commodity, and delight. Make it well, make it so that it serves its purpose and what may be future purposes, and make it beautiful. Sometimes there's too much emphasis on making things beautiful at the expense of its utility, right? Or making it very solid and firm, engineered so well, but not so delightful, right?
Right. So, our cities, and I touched on this a moment ago, but cities want to see economic development, and so they're sometimes eager to see parcels of property developed. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you will hear from companies that may want to do business. They say, well, we have sort of a way of doing things. This is our model. You talk about maybe a Target in an urban area. Sometimes they say, well, this is what we do. We do a box. That's our format.
Sure.
Are cities who hunger for development of key parcels, for instance, do they sometimes not hold companies' feet to the fire in terms of coming up with something that works for the city, not just for the company?
Yeah, that happens. It doesn't need to, but yeah, it
Why
happens.
doesn't it need to?
Well, look, I mean, if you have a standard prototypical design and you've already paid for it, right? It doesn't cost you any more money to build it again, because you don't have to hire an architect to design something new. And the more that it's repeated and repeated and repeated, I mean, that's the fundamental, right? That's just the economies of scale that makes things economically feasible. Okay. So from a business perspective, you totally understand that. It's not like, I mean, I don't think that that they're being evil.
Mm-hmm.
They're just doing what you would expect any reasonable business entity to do. Now the question is, how do you define your business? How do you define what is good business? In a community that doesn't really care about design and will take that or take anything, it's fine. Everybody's happy, you know? In a community that cares about the difference, and a community that believes that, you know, there's something about our neighborhood or our city or our town that we really care about, and we want you to pay attention to that. I don't think it's unreasonable for the city to state their point of view on it. Yeah, so. Mm-hmm. But if it doesn't matter to you, then fine. Go ahead.
Zoning. I want to talk about zoning, and they're probably, you know, at a cocktail party, if you say, hey, let's talk about zoning, people run the other way and strike up a conversation elsewhere. But
it depends on where you are.
That's true. There may be a few cocktail parties where zoning is a hot topic.
Yeah.
The ones you attend.
Yeah. Where I hang out.
So tell us about that. I mean, you did a lot of work on that issue in Denver, a lot of work in Milwaukee. You're talking about Houston today. Why is zoning such a key factor in sustainable, vibrant cities?
So, all right, I mean, if you think of our city form and the way the American city developed, right? It developed around the human scale. Right? So even with the growth in technology and industry, we grew our cities around transit. But when you got off the train, it was still a walkable distance from your stop. So when you look at the commercial grid of Milwaukee, Chicago, all these cities that have great streetcar systems, it's a half-mile spacing, typically, maximum. So that after you got off your streetcar, you're no more than a 5-minute walk away from where you want to go. That way of organizing the city created a mixed-use sort of condition. You could live and work on that main street. You could, if you could afford it, you could rent an apartment, still within walking distance of that, or you can buy a single-family detached house. We wrote codes. The original zoning codes were done in the 1920s really to separate and protect the social health, welfare, morals, all of these things. Zoning had a really big mandate, you know, but it mostly had to do with the proximity of things that were really sort of intrusive to healthy living, like a factory, right? So zoning had sort of a purpose in those times. Many cities, like Milwaukee, updated their zoning codes in the 50s after World War II. And they were replaced with a different model, a different vision for a city. A vision for a city that was more dependent on the automobile, more accommodating for the automobile. And had ideas about spreading people out, about reducing the density and the proximity. Ideas like minimum setbacks, right? So the further apart buildings would be, somehow the better off we would be, right? And then actually, an automobile base, and we need to have plenty of parking for whatever the use is going to be. So basically, you post-World War II, we created a pattern of surface parking lots and buildings floating around on seas of asphalt, right? Have you ever seen anything that looks like this? Okay. But you've never seen it right, turn of the last century way of making a city, right? So the automobile had a lot in terms of shaping how we built. And we had zoning and regulations and laws, quite frankly, that made it so. So in the 50s, for example, a street like Brady Street became what's called non-conforming, right? Because it didn't have, the buildings were not set back enough from the street, from the from the property line in the front, that any future building on Brady Street would need to be set back, because that would be, and it would need to have parking, right? So you go on like that for several decades in a city. You have the system of rules that somehow doesn't align with what people actually want. And it takes a little time, and then people start getting really mad about it, you know? So this is what LA is going through. I'm working on the update of the zoning code in Los Angeles. Exactly the same, like everything I learned in Milwaukee, Los Angeles can learn from that, right? Exactly the same things that we did in Denver. Same sort of issue. So what's the important thing about zoning is that it's a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And I think that it's a question of, do you have a vision for your city? Do you have a plan? Do you have an idea where you want to go? When we revised the zoning code in Milwaukee, it was mostly removing the barriers to the urbanism that already existed in neighborhoods and just making it easier to keep that or shape new buildings that would look like they're reinforcing those fundamental urban characteristics of those neighborhoods. Same way in Denver. I mean, the law, the residential zoning in Denver basically encouraged, in a growing city, encouraged sort of a real estate dynamic that encouraged people to buy two small houses, demolish them, and build one big house, right? And the neighborhoods were complaining, oh, they're densifying our neighborhood. And I was trying to explain to them, actually, your density of your neighborhood just went in half, okay? But it's the form, it's the character, it's the change that people were responding to. And so much of the work that we're doing, same is happening in Austin right now. So much of what we do today in the new approaches to zoning, and it is pretty exciting, is really focus on, A, what is the vision for your different parts of your city, and focus on the form and the character first, and worry less about use and all those other things that zoning used to deal with. I mean, it still does, but balancing design and form with things like use.
I just want to spend a couple minutes on transit, and we'll segue into some of your thoughts about freeways in cities, which you've been fairly outspoken about that, and then we'll talk a little bit about Milwaukee. But can an American city be a truly great city without great public transportation? Is it possible?
A small city can. I mean, a small town.
Define small for me.
One Main Street.
Okay. Small.
No, I mean, the greatness. I'm glad you actually phrase it that way. Oftentimes when we talk about transportation or transit, right, it's a discussion of cars or rail, right? Cars or buses. Cars are transit. And if you think about making of cities, you would never let the conversation become polemical that way. Because we're going to have cars. That's kind of reality, right? And transit is not sort of the antithesis of the car. It's just another choice, right? That's the way I look at it. I mean, we think of ourselves in the U.S. as having a lot of choices, having a lot of freedoms. And yet much of our thinking, from our federal policy to state policy to funding mechanisms for roads, really funnel toward prioritizing one mode of travel. Which in Milwaukee, which used to have an extensive streetcar system, goes away, right? Downtown, which had incredible buildings, incredible architecture, gets demolished and for years sits with surface parking lots. But the surface parking lots are viewed as, this is great for the city. This is great for Milwaukee. Now we have plenty of space to put the cars, so we won't lose jobs, right? So there's a question of, well, what kind of city are you making? I think of our post-World War II time in American cities in the change. It's called urban renewal, but I'm not sure what that means. As an experiment. It was like a big experiment, you know? We tried it. It didn't really work. I mean, there's no great city in the world that you can think of that gives priority to the automobile. But it just doesn't exist, right? I mean, would your dream city be a city of, like, all my retail is a drive-through, right? I don't ever have to get out of my car. Everything that I do, you know, that means that's not the way that people imagine great cities. You don't travel, you don't save up your money to travel to cities that have lots of parking lots and cars, right? I think even people who make cars don't do that, right? The fundamental thing that makes great cities is we're all pedestrians. We all have a distance that we're comfortable walking. And the way that we scan and understand information and our experiences are informed at the speed of walking is where the detail of a building matters. It's where, you know, the quality and the experience and I was just in Lisbon yesterday. You know, just the smells of things coming out of restaurants and just the sound of people and, right? So transit is simply a way to allow you, it's a means to allow you to create those kind of environments. Right? I don't think of it as an alternative to driving. It's just something that can help support a different pattern of development.
I saw you on a video on the web where you were talking about the fact that you're not opposed to cars and you kind of even like to drive a car, you know, and enjoy if it's pleasant surroundings. But you have gone on to say, though, that city freeways are failed experiments. Mm-hmm. Why, in your opinion, is that the case?
I've never seen any neighborhood in any city get better when a freeway was cut through it. Right? Does anybody know one that got better? I mean, so here's this interesting proposition. We use our tax money in ways that devalues private real estate. Right? And
you say this is a very conservative stance in some respects.
I actually think it is. I do. Because the question is, you know, cities, like people complain about like Paris is so expensive. New York City is so expensive.
San Francisco.
Right? San Francisco is so expensive. Does making them expensive, is a sign of evil, or is that just... It's just the reality of how our market works. If it's desirable, it commands a price, right? And so the challenge is, you know, I mean, some of these, I've talked to different cities about, and with groups who are advocating for taking freeways out of their city. And I've actually had conversations with people about, we don't want to take out the freeway because then the property values will rise. You know, and then it will gentrify. Like, there's a fear that removing this cancer will somehow improve our life, you know, and our health in a way that's going to ruin our lives, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, you know, what I mean by experiment is that there are cities around the world, Milwaukee is one of them, that have taken the freeway out and the traffic issue didn't get worse, right? Things can get better, actually. The West Side Highway in Manhattan, you know, for years it broke, like a dump truck that was carrying gravel or something, or asphalt to repair the thing, broke through the deck. It sat for decades before they could decide what to do. They took it out, they made a boulevard. There's fine real estate on the west side. And it's not like the cars disappeared. The Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco and the Central Freeway in San Francisco, they fell down. They took them out. Did San Francisco suffer? Did those neighborhoods suffer? I mean, what they're suffering from now in San Francisco, they become very desirable and very expensive. So that's a different issue, right? But no, I mean, that's another kind of a problem. But it just seems to me that the idea of the limited access highway in the city is simply the wrong thing. Cities from the very beginning have been about access and exchange. Social exchange, economic exchange, cultural exchange, and being able to get to that spot, you know. The limited access highway is a design to limit access, to prioritize movement across the countryside so you don't have to stop at every railroad crossing, you know, and every cross-county highway. But when you come to the city, it's a network. It's a street grid. And so when you choke it off, what happens actually is you induce congestion. It's weird. In city that's taken out the freeway, the congestion has gone down. I know, it sounds weird, but it's true.
You mentioned Milwaukee in this discussion, and maybe we'll just transition into that, because I wanted to ask you about the things that you did when you were the city planner in Milwaukee. And one of them was you were a strong advocate for taking down the Park East and replacing it with an at-grade boulevard, which is what exists today. More development now on tap for that area. You were very instrumental in the really kind of the recreation of the Beer Line B neighborhood. This is the area in the Brewers Hill area, part of Milwaukee. If you go there today, I mean, it's truly amazing compared to what it was in the mid-'80s when our former Governor Tony Earl wanted to build a prison at the Trostel Tannery, as some of you recall. Are those the things you're most proud of, or were there other things that maybe didn't get as much attention that you were equally proud of?
Yeah, I'm definitely proud of those. And, you know, I think one of the things that happened in that time is we were able to introduce planning into the process of how decisions are made again. And planning informed by broad engagement, community engagement, not kind of the planners top-down, I'm an expert, we know what to do, we know what's good for everybody, but more of an engaged process. So, for example, the taking out of the freeway, the Park East, was one of 13 catalytic projects in the downtown plan. That plan had hundreds of people's signature on it. It wasn't just, you know, we hired a consultant, but we did a lot of public outreach and public workshops to vet ideas, to get ideas. And this way of engaged planning, I think, it's absolutely necessary. I mean, because, you know, the implementation, we don't plan for like a timeline, we plan for an outcome, right? And so the outcomes are hopefully tested in the discussions at the front end. You know, here's where we want to be, here's what we want to accomplish. And then we have a mandate to do that. And one of the things I'm very proud of, I'm going to talk about it next Tuesday, actually, a little bit, at this downtown event, is, you know, the 20-year plan for downtown Milwaukee that we did in the late 90s was mostly done in 10 years, right? Then you guys updated it, right? And you know, they weren't small things. It was, you know, converting the one-way streets back to two-way and putting higher emphasis on walkability in downtown, and, you know, a crazy idea of building a public market year-round, and taking out the Park East Freeway, and focusing on more residential downtown, and completing the Riverwalk and things like that. But again, those weren't things that the planning department did, the mayor did, that I did. I mean, those are part of a broader, what we did is we hosted a broader community conversation about the collective future of the business community and neighborhoods and just general citizenry.
Were you surprised, quite candidly, how long it took for the area where the Park East was to begin to be redeveloped? It's had gradual stages, but it's taken a while.
Sure. Yeah, it
Or are we
has.
just impatient?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day. You know. I know. Look, I mean, so here's the deal. If you look at the Park East, it's this question of connectivity, you know, that I was talking about earlier. So by removing the elevated freeway and putting the street grid back, what happened is the land around that corridor actually becomes more desirable. I mean, if you actually look at if you look at the actual land that used to be in the public right-of-way, that was transferred to the county officially, right? Transfers to the county. I can't remember. It's about 25 acres or something like that. The story is actually everything that's happened around that boundary of the county-owned land. I mean, honestly, and my apologies, I mean, yes, I was expecting the county land to be the last to go.
Just because of the politics of it? Yeah.
Sure. Mm-hmm. The land disposition, I mean, that I'm not trying to be critical. I mean, that's just the fact of the matter, right? Whereas, you know, a developer buying a piece of land from a private owner, like that's a totally different transaction, right? So, I mean, major projects. I mean, the Pabst. I don't think that much interest in the Pabst would be there if the freeway was still there. I don't think all of the riverfront development that you see happening now would be happening. And so it would be interesting to see them, but I think that pretty much most of the private parcels around the fringe of the freeway have been developed. And so, no, it doesn't surprise me that much. I think that it is one of those things that, quite frankly, also, you don't want it to happen too quickly either. You want to have as many. I think what makes great cities is you have a lot of different players. You have a lot of different entities at work. You know, that was the idea behind the beer line. Rather than doing a plan that the city would sell off to one master developer, we essentially decided to be kind of the master developer in a way and do a series of our requests for proposals in as small a section as we could and really promote and discuss quality of design. You know, we did a plan. We figured out the funding for the infrastructure. We did a plan, a very high emphasis on pedestrian access to the river and organizing the blocks. And then did a series of RFPs, and in the RFPs really emphasized the importance of design and creativity. Not that what was being offered in terms of the amount of development or the price for the land wasn't important, but it wasn't the only thing, you know. And so you've got, I think, you know, each developer's take and great designers, like John Vetter, doing some really interesting and variety of things. Some very traditional in the transition up to Brewers Hill in terms of duplexes. Other developers' take was, stacked flats on elevator buildings. Some are corridor apartment buildings. Some are row houses. And so there's a whole variety of rental to owner-occupied. And, you know, it's organizing a bunch of small things, really.
What would you have liked to have done that you weren't able to accomplish? Because I'll bet there are a couple of things in your perfect world, Peter, you would have liked to have seen happen that just didn't for whatever reason.
I don't know. I felt like
Okay.
it's pretty good. I mean, no.
What about, we were kidding about this earlier, what about 794?
Well, yeah. I mean, you had a chance there. It was down. It wasn't like. When it was not up, didn't it seem like there's a lot of opportunity and land there? And
It was very different.
Yeah.
It was very different.
well, yeah. So I don't.
Not so much.
I don't know. I feel like we were pretty busy all the time. I think, laying the foundation for transit, I mean, the Milwaukee streetcar is moving forward now.
Let's talk about that, because it still remains something of a controversial, issue in this area.
I think, and I don't know why. I mean, yes, it does. I mean, it is one of the recommendations in the downtown plan, actually, again. So it wasn't like in the late 90s people thought it was crazy to do that. It takes a while sometimes for, these kind of infrastructures to come to fruition. I mean, in Denver, we have, there were, I think, at least 3 referenda that failed until people began to realize that transit, if we're going to continue to grow as we've been growing, we're not going to be able to grow around the automobile. I don't know why transit at this point in time is so controversial in a situation like Milwaukee. It does. Okay, so for example, in Los Angeles, I'm doing some work in Los Angeles, and transit, they're established neighborhoods, and we also had some of this in Milwaukee, established neighborhoods, right? And so folks are concerned that transit is only going to just bring more people. And if there are more people, then there'll be more congestion and all these other things. So I understand that. I mean, I sort of understand the struggles with that. But there's a lot of land in downtown Milwaukee. There's a lot of land in and around the neighborhoods. And the ability to have transit as a way to further boost the potential and the opportunity of that development for added growth is, I think it's a good thing.
Since you don't live here, this is maybe unfair, but I'm sure you've heard some of the arguments here, and the two that I often hear from people who are opposed to the streetcar, they'll say it simply doesn't go far enough. If you're going to build a streetcar system, why are you doing a 2.5-mile route? That really doesn't accomplish the goal of moving people to jobs.
Yeah.
It doesn't do that. You hear that. You hear about whether Milwaukee is dense enough to support a streetcar, or that the returns on the investment simply don't end up with you saying this is a good economic proposition. Well, what do you say when you hear arguments like that? Well, they'll say that it costs a lot to maintain, it doesn't pay for itself, and the promise of development near rail stations maybe is not what it's said it's going to be. When you hear those kinds of arguments, what's the counter to that?
In a regional transit system, I think about it's not like freeways pay for themselves, right? I mean, they're not free. We pay for them. It's a question of priority, like we're willing to pay gas tax, but we're not willing to raise gas tax because it's too high, right? And then we have this crumbling infrastructure. So it's just this weird kind of, like we're okay with it to a certain point, but then we're not actually committed enough to maintain it. The thing, again, I think about transit from the perspective is it's a business proposition. It's a value capture, as we say. You make the investment and you can actually create value in doing so. You can support more density. You can support a greater mix of use. It gives you the opportunity to make these walkable urban places that are very desirable. Right? There aren't very many. Walkable urbanism, again, exists primarily in places that prioritize people and bicycles and so forth. It doesn't mean you can't have cars, but people have more choices about how they move about. And so if you have a vision for downtown as having more people walking around, if you have a vision and a desire to have more businesses in downtown, you need more people living downtown, right? But if you're going to have more people living downtown, you need to make it in a way that gives people a very clear, reasonable choice about whether they own a car or not, or do they depend on a car. And, car and the role of the car is changing significantly. Like, how many of you use Uber or Lyft? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I got here on Uber just now. I use it everywhere. And or a Zipcar. You have Zipcar in Milwaukee?
You do.
Okay. So this changes the dynamic so much in terms of how we make cities and how we design our cities. But it fundamentally goes back to simply the pedestrian scale, the human scale.
Where do you see opportunities for a city like Milwaukee? When you come back to see friends, where are the opportunities? What could we be doing, just from your perspective, that maybe we haven't done so far? Not asking you to be critical of current mayors or current common councils or city, county leadership. I'm just saying, as a city planner, what strikes you?
I think the opportunity, well, what we were talking about earlier, I mean, coming back to Milwaukee to me, I mean, it's not just seeing my friends. I mean, there is this kind of there's such a quality of this place. And I think building on the strength of the sort of the built environment and those characteristics, and sort of reinforcing the discipline of what those places have to offer, I think is actually, I think that is that's a differentiator for the city that I don't think should ever be ignored. I mean, I think one of the things, working for Norquist for those 8 years, I mean, that's one thing that he really, really understood. He was very passionate about. He would spend his political capital on these things. And I was happy about that, because it made my life a lot easier. But, because there were things that I cared about as well. I think the other piece of this is, there is a, so my son he just graduated college, and he's living in the Bay Area. It's pretty expensive there.
I have family out there. It's really expensive
for
out
a new
there.
college graduate.
Yeah.
And I think that, the ability to further attract young professionals. I mean, I think Milwaukee is one of the top places in terms of sort of young professionals organizing themselves, and right. I think that, quite frankly, it's the future of any city, quite frankly. And I think that is a place that the city has a lot to build upon.
Here's my final question. We'll take about 15 minutes of questions from the audience here. I think we kind of mentioned this early, and we talk about the cost of living in a place like San Francisco, and there are parts of Milwaukee now that have become considerably more expensive. As a city planner, how much concern is there for people like you when we do see parts of cities being completely born again, but at a cost to people who may have lived in neighborhoods and don't have the means to necessarily continue to live in those neighborhoods? The gentrification issue.
Yeah, so that, I think, it is a big deal. And I think, quite frankly, with the return to the city and cities getting stronger again, I think we will hear more and more about concerns of equity. And more cities are focusing on equity concerns in the way they do planning, as a starting point. And so, a lot of it depends on the market that you're in, too, right? So in San Francisco, my friend John Ram, who's the planning director there, who's a UWM grad.
Good planning school. Good.
Great school.
Yeah.
He, they can pretty much make developers do a lot of stuff.
They want in that badly.
Yeah, and so affordable housing and affordability is a big deal for them. So I mean, I guess I'm just saying that, right, it varies. City like Houston has a vision, get more people living downtown, right? So the city council and the business community, I think in 2012, did a downtown living initiative where they offer incentives, $15,000 per unit for residential to a developer, at least 10 units. They started with, I think, a maximum of, like they said, we'd offer this for 2,500 units and then we're going to cut it off. I think last year they just extended it to 5,000 units, and I think they're within 50 units now of making that happen. You wouldn't think in a growing city like Houston, as wealthy as Houston is, that they would have to subsidize developers. But it's important to them, so I guess they do, and they found a way to finance it. A lot of it has to do with pushing that money into infrastructure improvements to make the city more walkable, because downtown Houston's not that walkable. But you know, they're thinking about those things, and you know, I think that's just, I think it's going to continue.
It's got to be incorporated into the vision if you want it to happen.
It does, and again, I think it's really a question of, I mean, Austin, Texas is the same way. Austin is a very interesting city. Wow, they have to talk about everything over and over and over. But they also have you know, their economic growth, like, and their population growth, like, it's just off the charts, right? Mm-hmm. And the struggle that they have is, you know, you've got a whole contingency of folks who've been in Austin for a long time or were there, you know, they moved there 20 years ago, and they're really frustrated with all these new people that are coming in, right? And then at the heart of it, too, is some rising concerns about affordability. Denver, we have the same challenges. I mean, it's probably, if you're a renter, probably over 35% of your average income is going to rent, right? Mm-hmm. So rents are rising. But these are also the times that, from a social perspective, you know, there are, it creates the sort of cultural setting for maybe compulsory requirements to kick in to ensure that affordability.
Mm-hmm. Let's take 3 or 4 questions from the audience. Please raise your hand. Ryan has a microphone. He'll come over to you. I'm going to go to this gentleman right there in the back. Hang on one second. Yeah.
Hi, Peter. I recall from my student days that Kant read Hume, and it awakened him from his dogmatic slumbers. And I'm just wondering, since the last time we talked, right before you went to Harvard, has there been anything that caused you to fundamentally question something or actually learn something new? I mean, in other words, as far as the way we talk about this, it seems very, you know, like nothing's changed. But I mean, what has changed in your thinking over the last 10 years? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think the main thing that has changed is, I don't think it's changed, I guess my greater belief in the value of engaging communities in planning. And I think part of it is the tools that we have to do that compared to 10 years ago are much more sophisticated. Our ability to develop visual models, our ability to bring data. You hear today, people talk a lot about data, right? Big data, data sharing, right? And it's all very important. And you have to ask yourself, well, why is it so important to us? I mean, because is it the thing that if you put numbers to it, then the politics goes quiet, right? Some people actually believe that, and actually it's true to some degree, I think. But I think that the primary thing that's changed for me is just this, because I've never been so much of a quantitative person. I've been more of it's because of my training. I've been more of a qualitative person, but I think I've been convinced that the way that we use our data The way that we convert it to visual information just moves people much faster.
Other questions? Let me go back here since Ryan. Hang on a second.
Thank you. Just a quick question with aging populations. That's kind of my area of focus. And society in general is moving towards caring for older parents and stuff at home as opposed to an institution. And the trouble I have with cities, I'm wondering how we solve it. In the suburbs, you have a house and you want to bring an aging parent in, you convert one of the bedrooms into a room, maybe you have a garage or something. It's just not possible when you're kind of in a studio apartment or a one-bedroom apartment in a city to kind of bring aging parents in if they're not already there. And I'm just wondering how does that's going to continue in the future, and just how do we plan for that in cities? I live and teach down in Chicago, so it's kind of doing a lot more stuff that way. But I mean, is that in the plans of what Milwaukee's future is?
Well, but the situation that you describe of, I mean, in terms of an aging population, one of the things that has helped fuel the return to the city, quite frankly, are baby boomers who are aging. And quite frankly, they would rather spend more time where they work or where they live or where they meet their friends than driving in a car. Now, one of the things about focusing on making cities more walkable is that there's a whole population of children, young children, and older populations that don't drive. And so if we make our cities completely dependent on driving, we isolate people, right? If you go to any major city, the public rooms, the public spaces are places where you see grandparents and parents and children, or grandparents watching small children, and they're walking and right? People aren't driving them to the park, right? They're able to do that. There's a proximity. One of the things, but there are regulations that sometimes make that difficult. So the accessory dwelling unit, or some people call them granny flat, right? Having a house or converting your garage into another unit, in most cities that's illegal, right? Because it's a single-family neighborhood. You can't have two families living there. It's the same family. Okay, but you can't have another kitchen. I mean, there are laws that prevent it, make it illegal for you to have your mother live with you in a separate building on your property. Some people might like that, but not everybody. Right? So what's happening in many cities now is those laws are being changed. So in Austin, they're just allowed everywhere. Well, that doesn't necessarily make sense either. But when you ask, well, what's planning do about it? I mean, I think the first thing is just removing the things that make it difficult for those kind of occupancies to happen. And then there's also other incentives. So around transit, most cities reduce parking requirements near transit, and you might get further reductions if the housing that you're doing is for affordable housing at some defined degree of affordability, or assisted care or elderly housing. And there's a perfect rationale for that. But at the same time, it allows people not to be in institutions isolated far away from everyone else, but they actually have the ability to walk to the store and do things.
You're over there with the microphone. You want to grab this guy right back there?
Hey, thank you. Real quick, I'm just wondering about Milwaukee. My question is there a structural flaw with Milwaukee County running the transportation, City of Milwaukee running city development, and the twain never meet?
Structural flaw. Well, I don't know if it's structural. I mean, so part of it is, how well the entities work together. I mean, I don't know that they need to be under one roof. in Denver, the Regional Transit Authority is not even a thing of a county. I mean, it's a regional transit, 8-county regional transit system. So, and we developed very strong working relationships, and they have good relationships with each of the cities that they're building the transit. It's early on. I mean, there's always potential for conflict, but because the transit folks are focused on building the rail, building the platform, and then the parking associated with it. And after that, nothing else, right? And the tendency for the city would be, well, we don't want to have big areas of parking closest to the platform. We want to have development. We want to have it a shorter trip for people who are working or living near the transit station. So it's that doesn't exist anymore, but early on that was kind of one of the conflicts that we had to
Let me take one final question. You're over on that part of the room. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
Back to Milwaukee. The Park East Freeway is down now. The Bradley Center is going to be coming down shortly. And a new NBA arena is going to be built. Looking at it, and the county finally got rid of that part of land for $1 last night. What would you do? Would you do anything different than what's planned by the city and the county in that area?
I don't know a lot about that deal, so, but I can tell you this: if you look at the downtown plan from the late '90s, we contemplated that one of the options for the development, if the freeway were removed, would be for an destination entertainment venue. Because if you think about the blocks between 4th and 6th, right, you have the convention center, the arena, right, and they make these super blocks. So it's a little difficult. I mean, they're big footprint kind of uses. And so we did contemplate that could be one of the options. In fact, I don't know if everybody knows this, the Harley experience.
Right, was going to be down.
So Harley was originally interested in putting the Harley experience in the Park East site, which actually was the reason why the then governor was okay with taking the freeway out. Before, he hated the idea. But when Harley liked it, he liked it. It worked for us, I think. Harley ultimately decided to go to the valley. But, I think we were already on the way to taking the freeway out. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I mean, that as a use was certainly contemplated as part of the redevelopment of the corridor. The important thing about it is what we were talking about earlier, is just ensuring that the development focus on the human scale. I mean, imagine all of us going to an event together, like, is the design of the space set up in a way that, we'd be able to meet, there'd be great places for us to meet and run into each other and see each other. And I think, any successful urban destination venue today will do that. I mean, there's much more sophistication in design and retailing and activating streets that people actually believe, people can actually make money on successful ground story activation and vitality. So I think that will be important to make sure it happens.
I'm going to wrap things up, and let me just ask a question that you probably need a half hour to answer, but I'll give you 30 seconds or so. You live in Denver, and you mentioned the fact that you've got this regional cooperation idea. Why is that so hard in Milwaukee? We have some business regional cooperation now, but what's different about Denver and Milwaukee in terms of the way they approach things as a region versus as city versus suburbs or city versus outlying areas? Is there something that jumps out at you that is different in the DNA of folks out there?
I think, part of it is there a clear shared interest? I mean, this is always the case in any kind of cooperative deal, right? I may not like you, but if you have a shared interest, right? I may not have the same values, but there's a clear, and it's either a threat or it's an opportunity. in the case of Denver, Denver had pretty divisive relationships with the surrounding regions. The mayor who I worked for is an amazing collaborator and amazing leader, and got all 31 mayors in the region to support Fast Tracks, which was the vote for expansion of the transit system. But he played a major role, and he's credited as sort of being that kind of a collaborator. So, in any region, and I'm not saying it's not happening, I'm just saying in any situation like this, I think you also need the leadership, but there needs to be a very clear shared interest to be served through that collaboration. And I think maybe that's one that's a little bit difficult to pin down.
I'm going to wrap things up there. I did want to mention to some of the folks in the room, because our next On the Issues conversation might be of interest to you. I believe it's sold out. Some of you might be coming anyhow. Professor Rob Sampson, who is one of the nation's leading social scientists, wrote a great book about Chicago, great American city, tremendous book. It's about neighborhoods in Chicago. He's going to be spending a couple of days here at Marquette. He'll be doing one of these events with us. A lot of very interesting material that he gathered over more than a decade in Chicago. And so he will be our next guest. He'll be here next week on the 17th. After that, on the 23rd, the state's Attorney General, Brad Schimmel, will be here, and we'll be adding even a few more things to our On the Issue schedule as the fall semester progresses. Having said that, I want to thank everybody for their time, their interest, their attention today, and most of all, I want to thank Peter Park for heading back from Portugal to be with us. Thank you very much.